Let's bring in MS Now Capitol Hill reporter Kevin Fry and former U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuade. She's also an MS Now legal analyst. Kevin, why did the committee release these documents and this video now, and what are the key takeaways here?
Yeah, I mean, look, the speculation, particularly from Democrats on this committee, who, of course, wanted to see this in a public forum, is that there were not a lot of revelations here. And so Republicans did not get out of this what they were hoping for. And also, this gives them a chance to essentially bury this on New Year's Eve, on a day where, obviously, a lot of Americans, rightfully, are not really fully paying attention to the news. In terms of the takeaways here, I mean, the top line from Smith was that he believes he had proof beyond a reasonable doubt in both of the cases he was handling. Of course, to remind you, that was both the January 6th case and the 2020 election conspiracy case that led up to the January 6th attack on the Capitol, and then separately his handling of classified materials. That one we still don't have a lot of details about because, as Democrats are keen to point out, we have not gotten kind of the long-form report on the findings of that half of the investigative work. In terms of some of the other takeaways here, he says that the cases were built not just on the word of Trump's enemies, but some of his allies, fellow Republicans as well. He batted away the suggestion that he took on the special counsel job because of any, quote, animus toward the president. He said that no, he received no pressure from President Biden to press charges against Trump, basically pushing back on the political angle of this. And he also faced questions about this reporting that has caused a stir amongst Republicans on Capitol Hill, that Jack Smith requested and took a look at the phone records of some of the key Republicans that Trump interacted with around the January 6th attack on the Capitol, basically saying, if you want to point the finger of blame, point it at the president himself. Here's that exchange.
To the extent members of Congress and senators are up in arms that this happened to them and they're seeking accountability, who should be held accountable for answering these questions?
Well, I think who should be accountable for this is Donald Trump. These records are people, in the case of the senators, Donald Trump directed his co-conspirators to call these people to further delay the proceedings. He chose to do that. If Donald Trump had chosen to call a number of Democratic senators, we would have got toll records for a number of Democratic senators.
Part of the argument from Republicans, there was a series of senators and one House member that had their call logs reviewed, was that essentially they should be provided some degree of above boardness because they are, of course, members of Congress. One other note here, he also said that he would not be surprised if the president pursued retribution against him and directs the DOJ to try to indict him.
We shall see. Kevin Fry, thank you so much on that. And Barb, Smith was pretty forceful in defending the case against President Trump. Let's listen to what he had to say.
You just made some pretty definitive statements about, your belief that President Trump was guilty of these charges. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe we had proof beyond a reasonable doubt in both cases.
What does it tell you, Barb, that Smith has been unwavering in his conviction that not only was there enough evidence, but there was no political motivation on his part or on the part of the agency as they pursued this case?
A non-event. That's the way the Justice Department traditionally does pursue its cases, based on the massive evidence that Jack Smith amassed and described in both his report and in the indictment. There's really no basis to believe that this was some political witch hunt, and yet we have heard this again and again from Donald Trump and from some of his supporters. I thought Jack Smith did an excellent job of debunking some of those claims. For one, there was this through line where there were a number of questions about, wasn't this just President Trump exercising his free speech rights to contest an election just as other presidents throughout history have done? And he explained, no, that's not what this was. He did have a right to claim he won the election, even falsely. But what he did that was illegal was to commit fraud by using the power of government, by trying to coerce state legislators, by trying to coerce members of Congress, by using false slates of electors to try to thwart the peaceful and lawful transfer of power. And so I think that anybody who watches this video or reads this transcript will be left with the impression that there's nothing political about this. This was a very strong criminal case.
So, Barb, Smith said the strongest aspect of the January 6th case was actually based on evidence provided by, quote, Republicans who put their allegiance to the country above the party. What do you make of the idea that Smith apparently built most of the compelling pieces of his case around Trump's allies?
Yeah, so it's both a good strategy, I suppose, because it rebuts any claim that these are just political actors with an axe to grind. But it's also just smart prosecution and investigation. The people who know best what was going on were the people closest to Donald Trump. Rudy Giuliani was a witness who talked about admitting that he knew that this was false, admitting that he knew that the claims he made about Ruby Freeman were false. People like the Secretary of State of Arizona, the Secretary of State of Georgia, election officials in some of the key swing states. There was an elector in Pennsylvania. These were the people who were refusing to budge because they knew there was no fraud in the election. These are the people who, I think, heroically put their loyalty to the country ahead of their loyalty to the party. But they were the ones who were going to testify about Donald Trump's activities to try to overturn the outcome of this election.
So really quickly before I let you go, Barb, Smith said that he hadn't made a final decision about whether to bring additional charges against alleged co-conspirators like Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, others. Had he continued this investigation, do you think we would have seen charges against them?
You know, it's hard to predict what he would have done, but he certainly could have done that. When you have unindicted co-conspirators in an indictment, it means you believe you have evidence to prove that they were people who committed the crime of conspiracy, which is entering into an agreement for the purpose of violating the law. And so what he said is he wanted to be efficient about his charges by focusing solely on the most culpable defendant, Donald Trump. But certainly down the road, I think whether he chose to, he certainly could have charged some of these other people.